The notice was taped to my door like a slap in the face. Official notice of eviction. Tenant has 30 days to vacate the premises. No reason, no explanation, just a cold, impersonal demand to get out. I read it twice, hoping I had misread something, but the words stayed the same. My rent was paid on time, every month. My apartment was spotless. I had never caused trouble. So why was I being singled out? I turned the paper over. At the bottom, scrawled in smug little letters, was a note from Mr. Whitaker himself, the building's aging, self-important slumlord who had made my life subtly miserable since the day I moved in. Nothing personal, just restructuring under new management. Bulletin. I knew what this was. Every other tenant in the building was white. They were staying. I wasn't. I stepped out into the hall, catching sight of my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had lived here for over 20 years. She was watering her plants like nothing had changed. I forced a smile. "Did you get one of these?" I held up the paper. She squinted at it, then shook her head. "No, dear, but I'm sure it's just a mix-up." It wasn't. It was a pattern. Whitaker had never outright said it, but it was in the way he talked to me. The way he ignored my maintenance requests. The way he watched me suspiciously when I had guests over. The way he made sure that when people like me moved in, they didn't stay long. I crumpled the notice in my fist. Not this time. I sat across from Whitaker in his musty, smoke-scented office, gripping the eviction notice with a steady hand. "This isn't legal," I said. "I've never missed rent. I've never broken any lease terms. You can't just—" He leaned back in his chair, that same oily smirk curling at the edges of his mouth. "It's nothing personal, kid," he said, ashing his cigar onto a chipped coffee mug. "Just business." I gritted my teeth. I remembered every thinly veiled insult, every ignored request, every side-eyed look when I first moved in. Like the time my heat stopped working in the dead of winter, and when I called maintenance, Whitaker rolled his eyes and muttered, "Some people just love to complain." Meanwhile, my white neighbors got their leaks fixed the same day they reported them. Or the time he patronizingly told me that this neighborhood wasn't always so diverse, as if I should apologize for existing. I had swallowed it. Let it go. But this was war. "You're targeting me because of my race," I said flatly. He gave a mock-offended scoff. Now, let's not go throwing around accusations. The decision's final." I stood up. "We'll see about that." Because if he wanted to play dirty, I was ready to fight back. I sat across from attorney Maya Patel, her office stacked high with legal books and folders labeled Housing Discrimination Cases. She skimmed through my eviction notice, her lips pressing into a thin, displeased line. "This is illegal," she said finally, flipping to a page in a state housing law handbook. "Your lease is still active. He can't just evict you without cause." I let out a breath, half relief, half frustration. "So I can fight it?" "Yes, but—" She hesitated. I knew there was a but. "Whitaker owns the building," she continued, setting the paper down. "That means he has room to make things difficult. Even if you fight this in court, he can stall, file false complaints, refuse repairs, harass you with legal loopholes. He can make your life hell while you wait for a ruling." I clenched my jaw. So he's protected because he has money and power? More like he knows how to work the system. He's a slumlord, Alex. He's probably done this to other tenants before. You wouldn't be the first. I exhaled slowly, my fists curling against my knees. "And if I fight him?" She sighed. "You'd probably win, eventually, but we're talking months, maybe a year of stress, legal fees, and him making your life miserable." That was the problem. Whitaker wasn't trying to play fair. He was trying to exhaust me into leaving. I refused to give him that satisfaction. Maya leaned forward. "Look, you have options. We can send a cease and desist letter, put public pressure on him, maybe even get a tenant rights group involved. But unless you own the property—" I blinked. She kept talking, but my mind had latched onto something else. Unless you own the property. A new idea ignited in my brain. I left Maya's office without a clear solution, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't leaving without a fight. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in bed, scrolling through housing forums, researching landlord-tenant laws, looking for some way to hit Whitaker where it hurt. Then I found it. It started with an old real estate listing, one that looked shockingly familiar. For sale, multi-unit apartment building, price to sell. I clicked the link, my heart hammering in my chest. It was my building. Whitaker was selling the property, and had been for months. My stomach flipped. He had never mentioned this to any of the tenants. He had tried to kick me out before the sale, probably to make it easier for a buyer who wanted a clean slate. But there was something else. I dug deeper, looking into local property records. Whitaker was drowning in debt. The building's mortgage was past due. He had multiple liens against the property. He had been using shady financing deals to keep it afloat, and now he was desperate to unload it before the bank foreclosed. That's when the plan fully clicked into place. I wasn't just going to stop the eviction. I was going to buy the damn building. And once I did, Whitaker wouldn't just lose his power over me. He'd lose everything. I stared at the real estate listing on my laptop, heart pounding. It was real. Whitaker was selling the building. And if I played this right, he wouldn't just lose a tenant, he'd lose his entire grip on this place. But how? I wasn't some millionaire sitting on piles of cash. I barely had enough savings for a down payment, let alone the full price of an apartment complex. I needed advice. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Uncle Darren's number. He'd built his own real estate business from the ground up, flipping properties and turning them into profitable rentals. If anyone could help me figure this out, it was him. He picked up on the second ring. "Alex, it's late. What's up?" "Uncle D, I need your help," I said, launching straight into it. I explained everything. The eviction, Whitaker's debt, the building being up for sale. By the time I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he chuckled. "Damn, you're playing chess while that fool's playing checkers. So you think it's possible?" He exhaled. "It won't be easy, but yeah, it's possible. Whitaker's in a bad financial position. If he's desperate to sell, you could negotiate a seller finance deal, which means he finances part of it himself, just to get it off his hands. You'd need investors, maybe a crowdfunding push, but it's doable." I sat back, the pieces clicking together. So, instead of fighting to stay, I could own the place? "You don't just stop him," Darren said. "You make sure he never pulls this on anyone else again." I grinned, the decision made. Then let's make it happen. The next morning, I went door to door, talking to every tenant in the building. I expected hesitation. What I got was frustration and anger that had been simmering for years. "Whitaker refused to fix my heater last winter," Mrs. Patterson fumed. "He raised my rent twice but won't do basic maintenance," another neighbor said. "I caught him trying to evict my cousin last year for no reason," someone else added. Turns out I wasn't the only one he'd mistreated. By the end of the day, half the building was on my side. Some tenants even offered to testify about his discrimination, while others were willing to help fund the purchase. That night, I launched a crowdfunding campaign. I wrote everything: the eviction, the discrimination, Whitaker's shady business tactics, and the plan to buy the building. I hit post. Within hours, it started blowing up. Donations flooded in. Lawyers offered free legal advice. Activists shared the story. The community was rallying behind me. Whitaker had tried to push me out. Instead, I was coming for everything he had. The moment I walked into Mason Caldwell's office, I knew I was in the right place. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, and his desk was covered in real estate deal sheets, blueprints, and market reports. He didn't waste time with small talk. "I read your story," he said, tapping his phone screen. "You've got people fired up." "Yeah, but fire doesn't buy a building," I said, leaning forward. "Funding does." Mason smirked. Fair. You've got solid community backing, but this is a six-figure deal, minimum. You need someone who can bridge the gap. Someone like me. I exhaled. This was the moment. So, are you in? He nodded. I've bought worse properties for better reasons. Whitaker's losing money, and I like betting against guys like him. If we do this, we'll structure it smart. Lowball the first offer and make him think he's winning. My pulse quickened. And if he doesn't bite? He will, Mason assured me. The market's shifting and his financials are weak. He won't get a better deal. But here's the fun part. We're not telling him it's you behind the deal. I grinned. You want to play him first? Mason shrugged. A man like Whitaker only negotiates if he thinks he's in control, so we let him believe that right up until we don't. I shook his hand. Let's do it. Later that day, Mason reached out to Whitaker's broker. A meeting was set for Friday. Whitaker had no idea what was coming. Whitaker sat across from Mason in the back of a dimly lit steakhouse, sipping a whiskey he probably couldn't afford. I watched from a private booth, unseen for now. Listen, Whitaker sighed, rubbing his forehead. This place is a headache. The tenants complain, the city's all over me about inspections, and you know how it is. Certain kinds of people make it worse. Mason nodded like he agreed. You mean problem tenants? Whitaker scoffed. They don't respect a place like this, always demanding repairs, filing complaints, acting like they own the damn building. I gritted my teeth. He was still spewing the same garbage, still convinced that people like me didn't belong in his building. Mason leaned back, playing it cool. So, what are you looking for in a buyer? Someone who'll let me stay on as property manager, Whitaker said quickly. I know the building, I know the tenants. If we structure this right, I stay in charge and you collect the profits. I almost laughed out loud. The man was broke, desperate, and still thought he had leverage. Mason took a slow sip of his drink. That's an interesting idea. He paused, then said, Before we talk next steps, I brought someone in who wants to discuss the deal further. He motioned toward my booth. I stood, stepping into the light. Whitaker's smug expression vanished. His jaw tightened. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered. I sat across from him, placing a folder on the table. Surprise. His face reddened. The funding's solid, the offer is real, and the deal is already in motion. I slid the paperwork toward him. Whitaker laughed, shaking his head. This is a joke. I met his glare. Number this is business, and unlike you, I actually know how to run one. He stared at the numbers, his fingers twitching slightly. He was realizing how trapped he really was. The game had changed, and I was holding all the cards. Whitaker's smirk faltered as he scanned the numbers in the contract, his hand gripping the folder like he could squeeze the reality out of it. This isn't happening, he muttered, flipping back and forth between the pages as if they'd suddenly change. It is, I said evenly, watching the panic bloom in his beady little eyes. The building's lender has already looked over our offer. Unlike you, we actually have a financial plan to make this place profitable. They want stability. You're a liability. He snapped the folder shut. I have other buyers, he bluffed. Mason chuckled. No, you don't. You had interest, but they took one look at your debt and backed out. Your only way out of this mess is sitting across from you right now. Whitaker shifted in his seat, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Face it, I said, leaning forward. You're out of options. His fingers drummed against the table, his knee bouncing under the booth. He was calculating, searching for a loophole, a way to weasel out of this. And then I gave him one last push. You can sell now and walk away with whatever's left of your dignity, I said. Or we can start exposing your housing violations. I've got tenants ready to testify about your discriminatory practices. I also have a lawyer who'd love to introduce your history of shady evictions to a judge. His face drained of color. You wouldn't, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I just smiled. Try me. His jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists. He was trapped, and he knew it. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Checkmate. I saw fear in his eyes. Checkmate. The next morning, I stood across from Whitaker in a sleek downtown office, my lawyer beside me, Mason casually sipping coffee in the background. Whitaker's hand shook slightly as he signed the final page of the sale agreement. Each stroke of his pen sealed his fate. When he finished, he shoved the papers forward like they personally offended him. "There. You happy?" he spat. I folded my arms, taking my time before answering. "Ecstatic." He scoffed. "Enjoy your little investment, kid. You'll regret it." Mason laughed. "Doubt it." Whitaker shoved back his chair and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. But he wasn't just leaving an office. He was leaving power, control, and everything he thought he had over me. I exhaled slowly, looking down at the documents that made it official. Yesterday, I was his tenant. Today, I was his landlord. And he still didn't fully grasp what was coming next. The ink on the sale agreement was barely dry when I made my first official decision as owner. Whitaker was done. I walked into the building's management office, a dingy little space that reeked of stale coffee and old excuses. Whitaker sat behind the desk, his shirt wrinkled, his posture tense. He already knew why I was here. I tossed a termination letter onto his desk. "Effective immediately. Your services as property manager are no longer required." His nostrils flared. "You can't do that." I smiled. "I can, and I just did." He snatched up the paper, his hands shaking as he read it. "You think you know how to run this place? You don't have the experience, the connections." I slid a business card across the desk. "Meet the new management company. Fully licensed, reputable, and most importantly, not you." His face twisted in rage as he scanned the name. Unlike him, this new team actually cared about maintaining a property instead of milking it dry. He stood up fast, knocking over his chair. "This is a mistake. You'll regret this." I stayed calm. Maybe, but at least my tenants won't. I spent the rest of the day undoing Whitaker's damage. The ridiculous rules he used to target certain tenants? Gone. The maintenance requests he ignored, handled. The extra fees he snuck onto rent invoices? Eliminated. By evening, the word had spread through the building. Relief turned into celebration. People cheered when I announced that repairs were finally happening, that the arbitrary rent hikes were over. Whitaker had spent years making life miserable for people who couldn't fight back. Now, he was powerless, and he still hadn't realized the worst was yet to come. Whitaker was still sulking around the building like he owned the place. He walked the halls, lingering outside doors, muttering to himself. Maybe he thought I'd let him stay. Maybe he assumed there was some loophole he could exploit. There wasn't. I made sure of that. So the next morning, I had the pleasure of delivering his eviction notice. I knocked on his door. When he opened it, he looked like hell. His hair was a mess, his shirt wrinkled, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked defeated. "What do you want?" he grumbled. I handed him the paperwork. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises. Your tenancy is officially terminated." His eyes darted across the page, scanning for a way out. Then, finally, it hit him. His voice cracked. "You never put in a clause to let me stay?" I gave him the same smirk he used to give me. "It's just business." His face turned red, his hands clenching the paper so tight it crumpled. "You can't do this," he seethed. I have rights." "You did," I said, "until you signed them away." I turned to leave, but paused. "Oh, and just so you know, the new management company will be checking every unit for code violations. If they find so much as a single issue with yours, well, you might be leaving even sooner." For once, Whitaker had nothing to say. He just stood there, seething, powerless, and utterly defeated. I walked away grinning. Poetic justice had never tasted so sweet. I wasn't expecting my story to go viral, but by noon the next day, my phone was blowing up. The headline from a local news station read, "Tenant turns the tables, evicted resident buys building, kicks out slumlord landlord." It spread fast. Within hours, people were reposting the story, tagging housing activists, lawyers, and city officials. The comments flooded in. "Finally, a win for the little guy. This is how you handle a racist landlord. Take notes." Where's the Netflix adaptation? By the end of the week, I was on the phone with city council members, community leaders, and tenant rights organizations. "Your case is exactly the kind of story we need to highlight," Councilwoman Rivera told me. "Slumlords like Whitaker have been exploiting tenants for years. We're working on stronger housing protections, and we'd love your input." For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to injustice. I was helping change the system. Meanwhile, Whitaker was still flailing. He tried filing an appeal claiming that he was pressured into selling and that I had used unfair tactics. The judge took one look at his signature on every single document and laughed it out of court. No loopholes, no second chances. He lost, and the tenants? They were celebrating. Former residents started coming forward with their own horror stories about Whitaker. People who had been forced out, overcharged, ignored. "Wish we'd had you around 5 years ago," an older woman told me in the lobby one evening. I shook my head. I wish I had done it sooner. The community rallied, not just around me, but around each other. This wasn't just about one bad landlord. It was about showing that tenants could fight back and win. And this was just the beginning. With Whitaker gone, it was time to rebuild. Not just the walls and leaky pipes, but the entire way this building was run. I met with tenants and local businesses, figuring out what people actually needed instead of what some greedy slumlord thought he could get away with. Security upgrades? Done. Fair rent policies? Implemented. A system where tenant concerns were actually addressed? Non-negotiable. And the biggest change, we turned the building into a community. Instead of just renting, I set up a co-ownership model for long-term residents. The people who had been here for years, who had built their lives here, now had a stake in it. And when it was time for the grand reopening, it wasn't just a ceremonial ribbon cutting. It was a celebration. Neighbors who had once avoided each other gathered in the courtyard, sharing food, stories, and laughter. The local bakery donated pastries, the coffee shop down the street catered drinks. Even city officials showed up, calling the transformation a model for fair housing. Mason raised his glass to me. "You just turned Whitaker's nightmare into a dream for this whole block." I looked around at the people smiling, thriving, and finally at peace, and I realized this wasn't just about winning. It was about building something better. Whitaker stood on the curb, watching his empire crumble. The movers worked around him, hauling out the last of his cheap furniture and cardboard boxes. His life, reduced to a few battered belongings, dumped onto the sidewalk like yesterday's trash. His face was tight with anger, his jaw locked so hard I thought he might break his own teeth. He refused to look at the movers, refused to look at the tenants who stood nearby, watching his exit like a long overdue spectacle. But he did look at me. I stood at the front entrance, arms crossed, taking it all in. "You think this makes you better than me?" he spat. I smiled. "I don't have to think it." His eyes burned with pure hatred. I could feel the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had spent years pushing people down, thinking he was untouchable. Now he was the one being forced out. I raised my hand and gave him a slow, deliberate wave. His face twisted, his pride too shattered to even curse me out. Instead, he grabbed his last box, muttered something under his breath, and disappeared down the street. The doors to my building, shut behind him for the last time. I exhaled, letting the moment sink in. I had fought to stay here. I had won. But more importantly, I had taken back what was mine. Later that evening, I climbed up to the rooftop. The city stretched out before me. the skyline glowing in the last golden rays of sunset. This was my home, my community, my victory. I let the breeze hit my face, breathing it all in. Then I smiled, because I knew something Whitaker never understood. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning, it's making sure they never underestimate you again. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more brutal. Hand side, which is even more brutal.